Imagine becoming a butterfly while the world around you still eats leaves. Picture the tender bellies of newly unfolded wings, the wet shimmer of change, and the sudden absence of the safe, familiar branch. There is a cost to that transformation that almost never gets spoken of. Not the romantic cost of sacrifice, but a quieter, more insidious price. When you begin to look closely at your own thinking, when you watch how thought arises, how it labels, how it defends, something in you changes. And the people around you, who have not seen what you've seen, often do not know what to do with that change. This is the hidden cost of thinking too much. This is where suffering often begins. You may have noticed it in small ways. A joke that used to land feels flat. Conversations turn to autopilot. Weather, sports, the latest appointment, the same complaints and comforts. You find yourself asking questions that were once unthinkable, about the value of status, the rhythm of ambition, the currency of approval, and the room grows strangely quiet. Friends repeat familiar phrases. Family interprets your questions as criticism or confusion. Colleagues avoid the depth you introduce, not because they are unkind, but because they live by a different set of assumptions that hold their world together. The paradox is this: the clearer you see, the more you stand apart from the customs that sustain other people's lives. That separation is not moral, it is structural. It is the friction between two ways of moving through the world. Pause for a moment. Think of one relationship where you feel out of step. Hold that image gently in your awareness. Do not judge it. Simply notice the sensation that arises when you imagine telling that person exactly what you now see. Is there fear, relief, sorrow? Keep that sense with you as we go on. It helps to name what changes inside you when perception deepens. At first, thinking is a useful instrument. It remembers, plans, interprets. You use it to cross the street, to pay a bill, to solve a problem. But there is a different mode of thinking, a persistent, self-referring loop that does not solve problems so much as fortify a sense of I. It narrates your experience, stitches events into a story that proves who you are, and defends that story against contradiction. When your inquiry turns toward that loop, when you begin to notice that thoughts are arising rather than being you, two things happen simultaneously. One, the neat stories that once made social life predictable fray at the edges. Two, you become exposed to vulnerability, because the structures you relied on, identity, opinion, habit, no longer hold you like a scaffold. You begin to see how many of our everyday certainties are rituals of comfort, status measured by titles and possessions, security imagined as accumulation, pleasure sought as distraction. Once those rituals lose their unquestioned authority, you may find yourself withdrawing from the games or simply no longer wanting to play. But withdrawing is often misunderstood. Others may interpret your distance as judgment, as a refusal to belong, or as an attempt to impress. None of these may be true. The misinterpretation alone is enough to create pain. There are three common social reactions you are likely to encounter. The first is the pullback. People try to normalize your questions by joking or changing the subject. They may say, "You're going through a phase," or smile it off as eccentricity. This reaction can feel like a slow erasure. Your presence becomes less central. Your words treated as interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. The second is distance. Friends who once shared time with you gradually schedule less. Calls go unanswered. An invisible redraw of your social map occurs. The third is overt hostility or ridicule, being labeled unstable, unrealistic, or impractical. That can sting deeply because it draws a line where intimacy once lived. None of these responses are necessarily cruel. They are defensive strategies by people who prefer the predictability of old maps. You will feel grief. Grief is never a sign that you were wrong to look. It signals that something you relied upon is changing shape. Grief for the dinner conversations that used to soothe, for the laughter that once felt effortless, for the assurances that once vibrated like a warm thread through your life. This grief can be confusing because it sits alongside a quiet satisfaction. You have clarity that was not there before. You begin to suspect that the very clarity that heals you might wound your relationships. That tension is disorienting. What do people typically do to cope with this dissonance? They choose one of three paths, and each carries its own cost. The first path is camouflage. You keep your insight private. You perform the old roles, and you live a double life. On the surface, you laugh, you join in conversations, you play the part. Inside, you carry a separate truth, a compartment of freedom. Over time, this split becomes exhausting. You must remember what mask fits which group. Your energy diffuses. Your intimacy with others becomes careful and partial. The soul learns to tuck away its hunger in neat pockets, and life acquires seams that tug and ache. The second path is rupture. You declare what you see, bluntly and without patience, expecting others to change. You leave jobs, confront family, break patterns in dramatic strokes. There is a bravery there, but it often comes with loss. Without a soft landing, practical support, emotional bandwidth, a community to receive your new posture, rupture can isolate you further and produce regret. The world has obligations and ties that cannot be dissolved by truth alone. Leaving without compassion for the people you leave behind can feel like betrayal, both to them and to your own deeper integrity. The third path is spiritual triumphalism. You let insight harden into a new identity of superiority. You may find yourself judging those who have not seen what you see. You might speak from a place of "I am awakened," rather than from the softer stance of "I am observing." This form of arrogance is particularly corrosive because it cloaks a subtle need for validation. It replaces one form of belonging with another, a club built on exclusion, and the cost is the very compassion that makes insight ethical. Each of these coping strategies arises from fear. Fear of loss, fear of exposure, fear of being wrong. Fear is not a failing, it is a teacher. But if you let fear dictate your response, you will reproduce the same patterns you once wanted to transcend. So where precisely does suffering begin? Not with thinking itself. Thought is necessary, it structures our days. Suffering begins when thinking identifies itself as the self. When you believe the narrator is the same as the doer, when you mistake analysis for essence, thought becomes a defensive mechanism. It constructs a story about who you are, and then fights to keep that story intact. That fight takes energy and produces conflict when social reality does not match the story. You argue with others, you argue with yourself, you create friction. You suffer because you have invested in a narrative that demands constancy in a world that is in flux. Consider the lobster. It must shed its shell periodically to grow. The moment the shell cracks open, the lobster is vulnerable, soft, exposed, tempting to predators. If the lobster tried to keep its old shell, growth would stop. If it shed the shell in a field without the protection of rocks or shelter, it might be eaten. There is a tender, dangerous interval, the dark night between shells. Human transformation often includes such an interval. You are between identities, and during that time you are at risk, not in a sensational way, but in ordinary ways. Social neglect, misunderstanding, the slow attrition of friendships. The cost is not metaphysical punishment, it is simply exposure. There is a subtlety here that must not be lost. To think is not to be lost. There is useful creative thinking, problem-solving, artistic imagination, careful ethical reasoning that enriches life. The danger lies in thought that continually returns to itself, that rehearses and justifies, that labels and defends. This loop of self-referential thought becomes a wall between you and others. It prevents direct perception, because everything you meet is read through the filter of your narrative. You might see realities that you once missed, and that is good. But if you interpret those realities primarily to reinforce the self, you will be trapped in a smaller world of your own making. What would a middle way look like? It is neither hiding nor brand rupture. It is not a new superiority either. It is an integration that honors both the roots you came from and the truth you now see. Practically, 3 shifts can help you navigate the danger without losing the insight. First, stop defending your insight. You do not have to convince anyone. The urge to win hearts and minds is often a signal of attachment. Attachment to being right, attachment to being seen as changed. When you stop defending, you conserve energy and avoid setting up antagonism. That does not mean you should be silent when truth is needed, but rather that your words come from clarity, not from the need to secure your identity. Ask yourself before you speak, am I aiming for understanding or for validation? Second, practice embodied attention. Many of us live primarily in the theater of thought, ideas swirling, plans forming. Embodied attention invites you to return to the body, to your breath, to the sensations of sitting, to the small acts of daily life done with care. When thought arises, notice it without following. Feel the weight of your feet on the ground. Notice the rhythm of your breath. This practice does 2 things. It loosens your identification with thought, and it offers a language of presence that others can meet more readily than abstract insight. People can often tolerate and be transformed by your presence before they can be moved by your argument. Third, cultivate small, honest connections. Do not wait for an entire community to reform around you. Begin with one person, perhaps someone who has shown a hint of curiosity or quiet patience. Share with that person not a manifesto, but a moment, a question you're sitting with, a small observation, an admission of confusion. Honesty, expressed with tenderness, is contagious in a way that grand declarations are not. Over time, these micro-connections can accumulate into a network of mutual presence, an emergent community that resonates with your depth without demanding you leave your previous world in ruin. These steps are practical, but they do not erase pain. The dark night between shells will happen. Loneliness during transition is not necessarily a sign that you are failing. It is often a sign that you are on a different shore. The crucial distinction is whether you use that loneliness to tighten into defensive narratives or to widen into compassion. Compassion for yourself as you grieve, and compassion for others who have not yet traveled as far on this particular path. Compassion is not sentimental. It is a steady seeing that refuses to exaggerate either your virtue or another's ignorance. Watch for the seduction of spiritual pride. It appears as a subtle smile when others speak, a quiet impatience with different perspectives, or the slow social segregation of your circles. It will make you feel superior while draining you of warmth. Pride becomes another shell, hard and brittle, that you will eventually need to shed. The antidote is humility in the sense of practical realism. Acknowledge your limitations, accept the incomplete nature of insight, and remain open to being corrected. When someone you care about resists your view, resist the impulse to brand them as wrong, and instead stay curious. What does their resistance reveal about their needs, fears, and commitments? There are also ethical duties that cannot be dissolved by personal clarity. You will have obligations to family, to work, to community systems that rely on you. Honor those duties even as your inner life shifts. Do not romanticize the idea of suddenly walking away. Wisdom does not require martyrdom nor cruel self-protection. Sometimes staying, with honesty, with boundaries, with gradual disclosure, is the most responsible form of integrity. If leaving becomes necessary, plan it with care so you do not expose yourself or others to unnecessary harm. Where does hope enter this picture? Hope is not a promise that everything will be easier or that your social map will immediately rearrange itself in your favor. Hope is the quiet recognition that authenticity attracts its own kind of companionship over time, that new communities often form not through grand proclamations, but through patient, consistent presence. People who have moved through this passage often report that, after a season of thinning, a few deep ties emerged. Friendships that did not require constant performance. Communities that welcomed inquiry rather than shunned it. Work that fit more into their values than their old roles did. These are not guaranteed, but they are possible. They emerge when you carry your insight with gentleness rather than with a banner. Let me offer a candid image. You are a person in a small boat on an enormous sea. The boat is your current life, relationships, job, habits. The sea is your inner landscape of insight and confusion. At points, the sea lifts you closer to sky. At others, it crashes you against what you thought was safe. The question is how you navigate the waves without burning the boat or losing yourself to fear. Navigation requires steadiness, skill, and companionship at times. It requires knowing when to row, when to rest, when to mend the sails. The cost of thinking too much is not a verdict, it is a reality to be managed with courage and care. Before we close, let me invite you into a small practice. This will not erase the difficulties, but it may give you a tool to meet them with a steadier heart. Find a comfortable seat. Rest your feet on the ground. Let your hands fold gently in your lap. Close your eyes if that feels safe. Bring your attention to your breath. Notice the inhale. Notice the exhale. After a few breaths, bring to mind a thought that often pulls you into replaying or defending yourself. Notice how it appears in the field of awareness. Do you feel a tightening, a tendency to cling? Watch that sensation as if you were watching a cloud pass through the sky. Do not try to push the thought away. Instead, notice the tendency to follow it, to add another sentence to its story. Now, without changing anything, bring attention to the body, the weight in your feet, the temperature of the air on your skin, the rise and fall of your chest. As you shift attention from the content of the thought to the felt sense in your body, observe whether the identification with the thought softens. Stay with this simple noticing for a minute or two. When you are ready, open your eyes. This practice is not a cure, it is a rehearsal of attention. Over time, repeated, it loosens the automaticity of being taken hostage by thought. In closing, remember this. The fact that some relationships thin or even dissolve as you change is not an indictment of you or of them. It is part of the cost of increased clarity. The treasure you are left with is not a triumphant isolation, but a truer self, less encumbered by masks. Courage is required, yes, but so is compassion, for yourself and for those who have not yet stepped into this inquiry. Hold both firmness and tenderness. Be patient with the slow formation of new communities. Beware of the trap of becoming a new kind of elitist. Keep your practice practical. Stop defending unnecessary battles, return often to embodied attention, and invest in small, honest connections. If this resonated, if it touched something tender inside you, consider continuing this way of exploration. There are many texts and talks that explore these themes further. Some resources inspired by this kind of inquiry are linked below. If you want more content like this, practical reflections, short guided practices, and invitations to contemplative community, subscribe and join the conversation. You do not have to do it alone, and you do not have to abandon your responsibilities to follow an inner call. Do it with care. Do it with compassion. The shedding is difficult, but what emerges is not loss alone. It is the beginning of a life lived with a little more honesty, a little more courage, and a little more heart.